increase in unemployment, because job losses happen, but job gains take time. It takes time for entrepreneurs to create new jobs. So those are kind of short-run costs associated with trade, which are called short-run adjustment costs. Okay, so those are the negatives I talked about. One is the impact of trade on inequality, and the other one is short-run adjustment costs. Now let's talk about another theory of trade, which is increasing returns-based model of trade. So Ricardo was 1817. Let's fast forward to 1979. What happened in 1979? Has anyone heard of Paul Krugman here? Okay. So Paul Krugman is one of my favorite economists, and is very well known because of his New York Times blog. So he writes a blog under the name Conscience of a Liberal, and he is very famous. So he received a Nobel Prize for his contribution to trade theory, and I'm going to describe the Nobel Prize winning idea without using any maths. We'll see how that goes. So what Krugman and many others observed is that there was a lot of trade going on between countries which are very similar. So there was a lot of trade going on between Europe and United States. Okay, and they had very similar levels of technology and other kinds of resources. And what was the kind of trade? So England was exporting cars, not England, Europe in general. England doesn't export a lot of cars, even though it has some, like Jaguar and others. But Germany is the major car maker, right? So German cars would be exported to the US, and US cars would be exported to Germany. So you have very similar things being exchanged across borders. One extreme example of this that I show in my undergraduate trade class is two-way trade in golf clubs. Golf clubs, very similar thing. So the US exports roughly $400 million worth of golf clubs every year, and it imports $400 million worth of golf clubs. So these are different types of clubs from different countries, but pretty much similar things. You can't explain this kind of trade based on technological differences and or resource endowment differences. So Krugman's idea was that to explain this kind of trade, you need two things. One, you need increasing returns to scale in production. Now that's a very big thing. What it means is that if you produce something at a large scale, its cost of production should decrease. Okay, so there are many production processes which exhibit this feature, that if you produce it at a large scale, average cost of production is going to be less. Cars are a classic example of that, because you have to set up a huge assembly line. If you produce 5 cars, it's going to be enormously expensive, but if you produce 5,000 cars, it's going to be very cheap. Okay, so that's the idea of increasing returns to scale. The second feature is love of variety. What is love of variety? Consumers want to have access to a large number of varieties. Okay, so consumers want to have access to a large number of cars to choose from. You can, many families own multiple cars, so they don't want the same model. Okay, you guys don't know because you are very young, but when we were growing up, only 2 cars made in India. One was Ambassador and the other one was Fiat. So both lousy cars. People didn't have a choice. Right? Then Maruti came in the 80s and things changed, and in the 90s you had all kinds of things. So now if you go and see any parking lot, right, you will see at least 20 different models of cars. So that tells you that people have a love of variety. Okay? So the idea of Krugman is that if there are increasing returns to scale in production and people want to have access to many different varieties, then it makes sense for countries to concentrate on fewer varieties and produce them at a large scale and then exchange among each other. Okay, so let's go back to the US and Europe example. So if the US is not trading, maybe they will produce 6 cars. Okay, say the demand is such that they are producing say 100,000, 1 lakh of each model. 6 cars, 1 lakh model. Maybe Europe is doing the same because Europe overall is the same size as the US. But if they trade, so before trade, consumers in each country have access to just 6 models, right? Now if they trade, maybe the US can produce many maybe the US can produce, say, 5 models, or doesn't matter how many, this could be 6, at a much larger scale, and Europe can do the same thing. So let's keep it 6, 6. So each is still producing 6, okay? But now consumers in both countries have access to 12. They can exchange, right? Or they can reduce the number, and it depends on what numbers you assume, but you can show with these things that overall the two countries' consumers have access to a larger number of varieties than they could do when they were not trading. And the gain here comes from economies of scale, because each model will be produced on a larger scale, because you are not producing just for your domestic market, you are also going to export. Okay, so earlier you were producing only for your domestic market, you were constrained by the size of your domestic market, right? So now you can produce a lot more because you can export it, and then you exchange. So let me illustrate this idea with a slightly simpler example. So suppose there are two people, and they are both good cooks, okay, and they both like soup. Okay, so John and I both are good cooks. Okay, we both like chicken soup and potato soup. Okay, now one option is for me to prepare chicken soup and potato soup and then eat it. For John to do them. Okay, but what if I just produce double the amount of potato soup and he produces double the amount of chicken soup? Which one will take less effort for me? To produce double the amount of potato soup, or potato soup and chicken soup? Double the potato, right? And then both of us can exchange. So we'll still have, both of us will still have chicken soup and potato soup, same amount, but produced with much less effort, right? In the remaining time we can watch TV or whatever. So you use less resources to produce it on a larger scale. That's the idea. Very popular in the US, something called potluck parties. You guys know what potluck parties are? Right? Yeah. So they have the same idea, right? So suppose 10 people decide to have a potluck party, each person brings a dish, and you bring it which is enough for 10 people. That way you get to consume 10 different dishes, right? If you try to produce all 10 of them yourself, it will take you 10 days probably, right? But producing one dish at a larger scale is much cheaper. So that's the idea of increasing returns and gains from trade. So you produce at a larger scale, so that takes less effort. You're exchanging, so you get a lot more varieties. Okay, so potluck party is the Krugman's Nobel Prize winning idea. Okay, so these are, so that's a second model of trade. And the advantage of this is this kind of trade is that everyone gains. It does not have these redistributive consequences. It does not produce winners and losers that we saw in the traditional comparative advantage based models of trade. Okay, how am I doing on time? So these are the theoretical models. Now let me talk about some numbers, evidence. So theorists can talk about anything, but the real test lies in data. What do the data show? Okay, so are there gains from trade in data? Some level, it's very simple to see that many times countries simply don't have access to domestic production of a good. They just cannot produce that good domestically. So here is an example. If you live in Norway, there's no way you can produce oranges, right? If you live in Norway, you cannot produce oranges. So if you want to consume oranges, you have to import. Okay, so that's because the production of oranges is ruled out by climate. But in many other cases, countries may not have the technological capability to produce a good. So if you live in Kenya, you cannot produce cell phones. Okay, but you can import cell phones, and it has tremendous value, not just for talking or social networking. Cell phones there have changed the lives of people. Now you do cashless transactions through cell phones. The first use was for farmers and others to find out the price of a good. So in India, for example, there's a very interesting study on Kerala, done by some economists, that how cell phones change their economic well-being. Because earlier, what would happen, they would go into the sea, catch some fish, then come to a coast, just guess where the price will be higher. Maybe 10 different boats land up at the same place, and you have too much fish there, prices crash, no one makes any money. Now these guys go to the sea in their boats, they have cell phones, they have agents on the land telling them where fewer boats are coming, where the price is higher, and things work. It's like magic. Okay, so they've shown that it has tremendous impact on the income of people. So importing critical goods has a huge impact on the well-being of people. Okay, you go to hospitals here, any hospital, full of machines imported from abroad. Okay, so I recently visited a friend's hospital in Ranchi. Ranchi is a pretty backward place, even by Indian standards, small town still. But all his machines, he has a pediatric hospital in Ranchi, and he was giving a tour, and all his machines were German. They were imported from Germany, and many of them are just not made in India. So that's true of many factories here. They import a lot of machinery from abroad. Without that, they won't be able to carry out their production process. So there's huge evidence of these kind of anecdotal evidence of gains from trade. And you also have the converse evidence that a lot of countries in Africa and Latin America, they decided to switch off trade. They decided to close their borders, and they started practicing what is called import substituting industrialization. And those countries did pretty badly. While you have countries in East Asia, you've heard of all these tigers, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and now Malaysia, Indonesia, and Korea here before this. So all these countries have become developed. So Korea and India had the same level of development in 1960, but now Korea is a rich country. We are still way poorer than Korea. So the per capita income of Korea and India both was about $250 in 1960, and now Korea's per capita income is $30,000, and we are at $2,000 or $2,500 per capita income. So we kept ourselves closed. We started opening up only in 91, and since then you can see there's been a tremendous growth. There are issues, development challenges, but I think trade has helped India a lot as well. And it has led to a massive decline in poverty in China. That is unprecedented. The number of people who've been lifted above the poverty line in China is unprecedented in the history of mankind. Because the population of mankind wasn't much, earlier, right? If you go 100 years back, maybe the population was same as the population of China today or something. So there's a huge effect. And there's a systematic study by Frankel and Romer, and so these were all kind of anecdotal evidence I was giving you. The systematic study looks at the impact of trade on per capita income. Does trade lead to an increase in per capita income? When you study these issues statistically or econometrically, key challenge is to show causality. So whenever you do applied research, you will see you always run into the causality problem. So I want to show that, or I want to study the impact of trade on per capita income. Does trade raise per capita income? So if I find a positive correlation between trade and per capita income, can I conclude that trade is raising per capita income? No, it could be the reverse. It could be that countries are getting richer for some other reason, and then they start trading. That is called reverse causality. So how do you solve that problem? So that's the key challenge in empirical work in economics. You have to find an instrument. You have to use what is called an instrumental variable approach. You have to find out some exogenous factor that leads to an increase in trade, which is unrelated to income. But I won't go into the technical details, but using an instrumental variable approach, Frankel and Romer showed that increase in trade leads to increase in per capita income. So that is a solid evidence in support of trade increasing per capita income. And there are a whole lot of micro level studies which look at industry analysis. Does importing inputs lead to increase in productivity of firms? So there's a paper by by a friend of mine using Indian data. He shows that increase in imported inputs leads to increase in or improvement in firm productivity in the case of India, and also competition forces firms to become more productive in many cases. So these are some other channels through which trade can affect productivity of firms. Then there's a literature on exporting. Many times exporting can make a firm better. So when you start exporting, you see what customers like, what are the other companies that you have to compete against, and while exporting you can get better. You can improve your production process. And I have a paper with a former graduate student of mine using Indian data, where we find some evidence of learning by exporting, that is, firms are learning to become better producers when they export. So there's some micro evidence along those lines as well. Okay, so now let me talk about the concerns that I mentioned earlier. Two concerns. One was adjustment cost, that is, jobs may be destroyed and workers may not be able to move to new jobs. So is there evidence of that? And the answer is yes, there is evidence that trade destroys jobs, and which is not surprising because there are many import competing industries which cannot survive import competition, so trade does lead to job losses. And in fact, there have been several studies in the US and elsewhere looking at the impact of trade with China. What has been the impact of trade with China on jobs? And there was a famous recent study looking at different labor markets in the US, local labor markets, and how import with China has affected those labor markets. And the result is that it has affected those labor markets adversely. And there are studies from Spain, Norway, and Britain as well, which show that competition with China has resulted in significant job losses. There's one study on Germany, which shows that overall in Germany there have been no job losses. In fact, there have been gains from trade overall. So there are job losses, but they are more than outweighed by gains in the regions which are focused on exports. So regions which are focused on imports, they suffer job losses, but then you have regions focused on exports like say Bavaria, Munich produces BMW, and wherever Volkswagen is produced, those places, they are huge exporters. So overall trade has created more jobs than led to job losses within the manufacturing sector in Germany. Yeah, I myself have done some work on this. So I have a paper that came out in 2009 where we looked at the impact of trade on unemployment using cross-country data. So we looked at data for a whole bunch of countries over a 20-year period from 1985 to 2004. So we were trying to see whether trade liberalization leads to increase or decrease in unemployment. Does trade liberalization lead to an increase in unemployment? That was the question that we were looking at. And we found that overall over this whole period, there was a slight negative relationship between trade liberalization and unemployment, in the sense that trade liberalization led to a slight decrease in unemployment. Then we were asked to look at a short-run effect, and there we used the timing of liberalization. So timing would mean India liberalized in 91. What happened immediately after India liberalized its trade? Okay, and there what you see is that immediately after a country liberalizes, there's a slight uptick in unemployment, but then it starts coming down. So for 2 to 3 years after trade liberalization, there would be a slight increase in unemployment, but then it starts coming down. That's the pattern that we found in our research. And later we also did a study on India where we exploited state level variation in India. So using Indian state level data, studying the same question, does trade liberalization lead to increase in unemployment? Now, for India as a whole, you have just one trade policy, right? So how do you create these state specific measures of trade liberalization? So there the idea was, to give you a simple example, say we have a state UP, and UP has large textile industry. Kanpur and other places, they have a large textile industry. If India cuts its tariff on textiles, say from 40% to 10%, and UP has a large textile industry, now UP is exposed to trade liberalization a lot. Okay, so we are creating this, doing this kind of thing by looking at the industrial composition of each state we are creating state-specific measure of trade liberalization. If a state has no import competing industry, that state is not exposed to trade basically, and so it shouldn't suffer. And using that kind of exercise, we didn't find any effect of trade on unemployment. We didn't find a positive or a negative effect, and we found some other interesting results that that urban employment declined with trade liberalization in states with flexible labor markets and larger importer share in net exporting industry. So states which had a flexible labor market, there's a lot of variation across states in labor laws in India. And so you can look at which states have flexible labor laws and which states have non-flexible, and based on that we found some effect. That is, if your labor laws are flexible, then you were kind of gaining from trade liberalization, but not otherwise. So that's the evidence on short-run costs. So there is some evidence in some studies that in the short run, trade could cause job losses and lead to an increase in unemployment. But our long-run study suggested that if anything, trade reduced unemployment in the long run. The second cost that I talked about was inequality. And here again, you find evidence that trade has led to an increase in inequality, and this has happened mainly since late 1980s in many countries. Okay, so what you found is that there's been a rise in inequality since 1979 or 80 in many developed countries, and also now in many developing countries. Before that, you find, if anything, there was a decline in inequality. Now, what has caused this increase in inequality? Is it trade or is it something else? So, studies have found that trade has played a role in increasing inequality since 1980s, but the main driver of inequality is not international trade, it is what is called skill-biased technological change. So, what this means is, in a very rough sense, is that if you can use computers, then you're doing better. If you cannot use computers, then you're not doing well. That's kind of the idea of skill-biased technological change. So the prime driver of rising inequality is skill-biased technological change. However, trade has contributed. And the reason why trade has raised inequality since 1980, but did not do so in the earlier period, is because in the earlier period, most of the trade was between rich countries, among rich countries, like between Europe, US, and so on. But starting in 1980, many countries joined the world trading system and started trading a lot. China, India, Russia, Brazil also opened up. So all these countries suddenly liberalized trade, and now you have what is called north-south kind of trade. So north is rich countries which are exporting skilled manufactured goods, and south is developing countries which are exporting unskilled manufacturing goods. And trade theory would predict that the impact of this would be to bring down the wages of unskilled workers in the north, because they are competing with these cheap imports coming from India, China, and so on. So that rise in inequality since 1980s is consistent with trade theory, but empirically people have found that most of the impact, most of the increase in inequality can be accounted for by skill-biased technological change and not trade. In fact, there's a recent study for the US, it's not even published, it's a working paper, which shows that this is not on inequality, this is on job losses, that 88% of the lost manufacturing jobs were because of automation and robotization of the production process, and only 12% can be attributed to trade. Okay, so you have technological change going on in the form of automation and robotization of manufacturing process, and that is killing a lot of jobs, putting downward pressure on the jobs of unskilled workers or workers who are doing routine jobs, and that is probably the main reason for increasing inequality, even though trade has contributed. So trade does contribute to increasing inequality and short-term job losses, but the question is, does that mean we should start imposing tariffs as the current US president has promised to do? I think that's a bad idea. The correct policy is not to impose tariffs, because tariffs are going to make things worse. So to give you some examples, in 2009, President Obama slapped a tariff of 35% on Chinese tires, and what that did was it saved 1,200 US jobs, but it resulted in Americans paying an additional $1.1 billion on more expensive tires. Okay, so there's a huge cost of imposing a tariff. It would have been better to write a check to each of these 1,200 workers who lost their jobs. You could have written them a check of 100,000. That would have been 1.2 million rather than 1.1 billion that was lost. Okay, so so imposing a tariff is clearly bad. Another example that I give in my trade class is US has tariffs on sugar. So US restricts sugar trade. Okay, the impact of that is $6 for every individual consumer in the US. So there are 300 million consumers in the US. Everyone loses about $6 on average. That translates into $1.8 billion. That saves again about a couple of thousand jobs. So if you get rid of tariffs, 2,000 jobs in the sugar industry will be lost. That's it. So it would be much better to write them a check, okay, rather than imposing a cost on the whole population. And so there are some other policies that you can adopt as well. So if workers are losing their jobs because of trade, it would be a good idea to have a well-developed social safety net. So the purpose of that would be to cushion the blow of a job loss. You give unemployment benefits for some time till they find a new job. Okay. Many times people complain that all these steel mill workers, they worked in a steel mill for 30 years, now they lose their job, and the alternative is to work in a McDonald's for a minimum wage. The solution there would be to give wage subsidies. You supplement their income with wage subsidies. And also, many European countries which have what are called active labor market policies, they have done better. Active labor market policies are one where you have job training programs for workers who are losing their jobs, and so those countries have done much better than the US. So active labor market policy, some people think of it like a trampoline. So you have a safety net. Safety net is if someone drops, the safety net catches them, prevents them from falling to the ground. But these active labor market policies are like trampolines. You guys know what trampoline is? Yeah? Bouncing up and down. So trampoline helps you bounce back up. Okay, safety net prevents you from falling to the ground, but trampoline helps you bounce back up. So these are retraining programs, active labor market policies, they have a role to play. Okay, so that's trade. Now I have two more things, but these will be shorter: immigration and capital mobility. So immigration, what's the impact of immigration? Okay, do we have any Parsis in the audience? No. So there's a story about Parsis. Okay, so when Iran was attacked by the Arabs and converted to Islam, Parsis fled to India in the 8th century. Okay, so the story is that they went to a local ruler and they said, we want to live here, right? We are being persecuted in Iran and we want to live here. So the ruler showed the leader of the Parsis a cup filled with milk to the brim, and he said, this is our land. It's full. There's no space for you. Okay, where are you going to live? So my land is full like this cup. There is no space to accommodate more people. So what the Parsi leader said, or did rather, he slipped some sugar into milk and said that the point that he was trying to make is that strangers could enrich the local community without displacing it. So they would dissolve into the society just like sugar into milk, sweetening but not unsettling. So that's the idea of immigration, that it can sweeten the land without unsettling it. And well,